In the summer of 2012, a small West Virginia town became the center of a case that would expose the complex and dangerous dynamics that can exist within teenage friendships. The story of Skylar Neese's death is one of betrayal and a stated motive that remains profoundly unsettling. The reason later given by one of the responsible parties was, "We just didn't like her." Skylar Annette Neese was 16 years old, a bright and spirited high school student living in Star City just outside Morgantown. She was the only child of loving parents who described her as intelligent, witty, and ambitious. Skylar had aspirations of becoming a lawyer and was known for her sharp sense of humor. Like many teenagers, she spent much of her time with her friends, socializing, posting photos on social media, and sharing her life online. Her closest friends were Shelia, Eddy, and Rachel Shoaf, both the same age and from the same school. To outsiders, the trio seemed inseparable. They took countless photos together, attended sleepovers, and spent hours communicating on Twitter and Facebook. But beneath this public surface, the friendship was reportedly deteriorating. By 2012, tensions had grown between Skylar and her two friends. Skylar had confided in others that Shelia and Rachel often excluded her or made disparaging remarks about her. On social media, she hinted at knowing secrets about them, posting cryptic messages that suggested a sense of betrayal. One tweet from Skylar, just weeks before her death, read, "Sick of being at home. Thanks friends, love hanging out with you all too." Another post simply stated, "You doing things like that is why I will never trust you." What do these digital footprints reveal about the true nature of modern friendships? On the night of July 6, 2012, Skylar climbed out of her bedroom window around midnight to meet Shelia and Rachel. Her parents, assuming she was asleep, were unaware. A security camera from a neighboring apartment complex captured her slipping into a car and driving away. That was the last time she was seen alive. When Skylar didn't return home, her parents immediately reported her missing. At first, authorities reportedly treated her case as a runaway situation, as it is not uncommon for teenagers to leave home for short periods. But Skylar's parents knew their daughter's character. They insisted she was responsible, dedicated to her schoolwork, and had never vanished without contact before. For months, her disappearance remained a mystery. Her parents posted flyers across town, pleaded for information on television, and continually urged police to keep searching. Meanwhile, Shelia Eddy played the role of a grieving best friend. She tweeted about how much she missed Skylar, attended vigils, and stood alongside Skylar's parents as they begged for her safe return. Rachel, too, appeared outwardly distressed. The reality of the situation, however, was far different. 6 months after Skylar disappeared, Rachel Shoaf broke down under the pressure of the investigation. During a police interview, she confessed everything. She stated that she and Shelia had planned Skylar's death for months. On that July night, they had driven her to a remote wooded area across the state line in Pennsylvania. Once there, they confronted her with items they had brought with them. According to the confession, Skylar tried to resist and escape, but she was overpowered, and the encounter proved fatal. Afterward, Shelia and Rachel concealed her body under brush and branches in the woods. When asked for a motive, Rachel's reported explanation was startling in its simplicity. "We just didn't like her anymore." The confession left investigators and Skylar's family stunned. How could two girls who had shared her secrets and her childhood carry out such a deliberate plan? The sense of betrayal was almost beyond comprehension. In January 2013, Skylar's remains were discovered in the location Rachel had described. With that, the missing person case officially became a homicide investigation. Rachel Shoaf agreed to a plea deal, pleading guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for her testimony against Shelia. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison with eligibility for parole after 10. Shelia Eddy, meanwhile, continued to show little remorse. Even as Rachel confessed, Shelia posted on Twitter about her daily life, maintaining a facade of normalcy. When her arrest finally came, it shocked those who had believed her performance of grief. In 2014, she was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The death of Skylar Neese became one of the most widely discussed teen crime cases in the United States, not only because of the circumstances but because of the seemingly trivial nature of the motive. This wasn't a conflict over money, revenge, or a romantic relationship. It was, by their own account, about two girls deciding they no longer wanted to be friends with someone. For Skylar's parents, the pain is lifelong. They fought to keep her memory alive, campaigning for changes in state law to improve the process for issuing alerts for missing teenagers, even when authorities initially believed the teen may have left voluntarily. Skylar's law, passed in West Virginia, is now her legacy, an attempt to ensure no other family waits as long as they did for action. The case continues to haunt social media. People share screenshots of Shelia's tweets from after the incident, including one particularly unsettling post made months later that read, "We really did go on 3." This was a cryptic reference to the fact that on the night Skylar disappeared, the 3 friends went out together, but only 2 returned. The story of Skylar Neese is unforgettable because it captures a disturbing aspect of social dynamics, where cruelty can be concealed behind selfies and status updates. It is a story of betrayal so profound that it feels like fiction, yet it was all too real. In a world where teenage relationships are heavily documented on social media, how can we discern genuine friendship from performative social bonds? And what does this case reveal about the capacity for such severe actions to arise from seemingly commonplace social conflicts? In 2003, a crime in Clear Lake, Texas, drew national attention, not only because of its severity, but because of the individual involved. The responsible party was not a known criminal or gang member, but a teenage girl who, just months earlier, had been honored with the title Miss Irresistible at her high school. Her name was Christine Paulilla, and her transformation from a celebrated student to a convicted party in a multiple homicide became one of the most notable stories of teenage crime in American history. Christine's early life was marked by hardship. Born in Long Island, New York, she was diagnosed with alopecia as a child, a condition that caused her to lose her hair. She wore wigs to cover the hair loss and reportedly endured constant bullying. Her eyesight was also severely impaired, requiring her to wear thick glasses. As a result, she struggled to fit in and grew up feeling like an outsider. When her family relocated to Clear Lake, a suburb of Houston, Christine's life seemed to take a positive turn. At Clear Lake High School, she met 2 popular students, Rachel Colorutis and Tiffany Rowell. They befriended her, helped her with her appearance, and provided a sense of confidence she had long been missing. For the first time, Christine felt like she belonged. In 2003, she was even voted Miss Irresistible by her classmates, a symbolic victory for a young woman who had once been the subject of relentless mockery. But underneath this new surface, Christine's personal insecurities and a troubled home life persisted. She began a relationship with a young man named Christopher Snyder, which was later described as unhealthy and isolating. Friends and family reported that Snyder was controlling and manipulative, distancing Christine from her support system. As her world narrowed, Christine's bond with Rachel and Tiffany grew strained. On July 18, 2003, Christine and Christopher went to Tiffany Rowell's house. Inside were Tiffany, Rachel, and 2 other young men, Marcus Priscilla and Adalbert Matt Sanchez. What should have been a casual social gathering turned into a tragedy. Christine and Christopher entered the residence armed, and what began as a visit quickly escalated. By the end of the night, 4 young people had lost their lives. Law enforcement later described the case as severe, citing close-range gunfire as the cause. The motive, investigators argued, was rooted in a combination of resentment, jealousy, and Christopher's controlling influence over Christine. For Christine, the young women who had once helped her rise in social standing had now become perceived rivals. For 3 years, the case went unsolved. Investigators struggled to find leads, and the community was left without answers in the deaths of 4 young people. It wasn't until 2006 that a tip finally led police to Christine Paulilla. By then, her life had reportedly descended into drug addiction and instability. When confronted by authorities, she confessed to her role in the events of that night. The subsequent trial captivated the public. How could a girl once celebrated as Miss Irresistible become involved in such a serious crime? Prosecutors portrayed Christine as an active participant, not a passive follower. They argued that she had opportunities to stop the events but instead chose to take part. The defense countered that Christopher Snyder had manipulated her, exploiting her deep-seated insecurities and pressuring her into participating. In the end, the jury was not swayed by this argument. Christine was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. Christopher Snyder never stood trial. He took his own life before police could arrest him. The case remains a significant example of teenage crime in the United States because of the stark contrast it presents. Christine was not a stereotypical bad kid. She had once been the bullied outsider who seemingly overcame adversity to win a popularity contest. She had been the girl other students looked at with sympathy and even admiration. Yet behind the title of Miss Irresistible was a young woman consumed by insecurity, envy, and the influence of a manipulative partner. Even today, the story raises uncomfortable questions. Was Christine primarily a victim of Christopher's control, or did she possess a pre-existing capacity for such harm? Did years of bullying and rejection plant the seeds of resentment that finally culminated in this act? For the families of Rachel, Tiffany, Marcus, and Matt, there are no answers that can bring back their loved ones. Was it manipulation, underlying mental health issues, or a calculated choice? The duality of her life, the public image of Miss Irresistible versus the private reality of her involvement in the crime, is what makes this case unforgettable. How does society assign responsibility in a case where years of social rejection and a controlling relationship intersect with an individual's decision to participate in such a severe act? On January 29, 1979, the United States witnessed one of its earliest and most significant modern school tragedies. The individual responsible was not an adult with a long history of criminal behavior, nor was she a student at the school. She was a 16-year-old girl who lived across the street from Grover Cleveland Elementary in San Diego, California. Her name was Brenda Ann Spencer, and her reported explanation for the attack would become a phrase that echoed through history: "I don't like Mondays." Brenda's early years offered glimpses of the challenges to come. She grew up in the San Carlos neighborhood, a suburb of San Diego, living with her father after her parents' divorce. The family's financial situation was strained. Their home was described as sparsely furnished. Brenda's relationship with her father was reportedly complicated. Teachers remembered her as a bright but disruptive student, a girl who sometimes clashed with authority and struggled to fit in socially. She often dressed in dark clothing and tended to isolate herself from her peers. Beneath this surface, Brenda was reportedly battling depression. Friends later said she made remarks about committing harmful acts and spoke of wanting to do something dramatic enough to get public attention. While some of these comments were dismissed as teenage angst, others were later viewed as potential warning signs. One notable detail that emerged is that Brenda had allegedly told classmates she wanted to do something significant enough to be featured on the evening news. In December of 1978, Brenda's father gave her a .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle as a Christmas present. In retrospect, this might seem like an unusual gift for a 16-year-old, especially one with a documented history of depression. However, in the late 1970s, firearms as gifts were not entirely unheard of. In Brenda's hands, that rifle became the instrument of a tragedy. On the morning of January 29, 1979, Brenda positioned herself at a window in her home, which was located directly across from Grover Cleveland Elementary. It was a Monday, and children were gathering outside the gates for the start of the school week. From her window, she fired toward the schoolyard, and panic broke out as students rushed to escape. Principal Burton Ragg and custodian Mike Suchar immediately intervened, guiding children to safety. Both men tragically lost their lives while protecting the students. Several others, including 8 students and a police officer, were injured but survived thanks to the swift response of staff and emergency teams. As police surrounded the Spencer home, a tense standoff unfolded. Brenda remained inside for hours, refusing to surrender. During this time, a reporter from the San Diego Evening Tribune managed to reach her by phone. When asked why she had targeted the children and staff, Brenda's reply was both direct and unsettling. "I don't like Mondays. This livens up the day." That one sentence became a headline across the country. It was quoted in newspapers, repeated on television news, and ultimately immortalized in popular culture. The Irish rock band the Boomtown Rats later wrote the hit song "I Don't Like Mondays," inspired directly by her words. Eventually, Brenda surrendered and was taken into custody without further violence. Investigators searched her home and confirmed she had carried out the attack with the rifle she received for Christmas. The trial was swift. Despite her age, Brenda was charged as an adult. In court, her defense pointed to a history of depression, suicidal thoughts, and even possible brain damage from a past bicycle accident. Psychiatrists testified that she suffered from serious mental health struggles, but the prosecution argued that she knew exactly what she was doing, and her own statement to the reporter was used to reinforce their point. In 1980, Brenda pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder and assault with a deadly weapon. She was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Due to the nature of California's parole system at the time, Brenda has been eligible for release multiple times over the years. Each time, parole boards have denied her request, citing concerns about her lack of expressed remorse and the potential danger she might still pose. The impact of Brenda Ann Spencer's crime goes far beyond San Diego. At the time, school attacks were incredibly rare. The idea of a teenage girl deliberately targeting elementary school children was almost unthinkable. Her age, her gender, and especially her casual explanation made the case resonate worldwide. For the families of Principal Ragg and Custodian Suchar, the pain has lasted for decades. Both men were remembered as heroes who gave their lives protecting children. For the students who survived, the memory of that Monday morning remained with them into adulthood, with many later describing lingering anxiety associated with school environments. Today, Brenda Ann Spencer remains incarcerated, her parole denied again and again. Whether she will ever be released is uncertain, but her name will forever be linked to one of the earliest and most widely recognized school tragedies in America. When an act of this nature is explained with a motive as seemingly trivial as, "I don't like Mondays," how should a society and its justice system navigate the complex intersection of personal accountability, documented mental health struggles, and the environmental factors that may have contributed to the tragedy? In the winter of 1958, the nation's attention was fixed on a series of crimes across Nebraska and Wyoming that resulted in 11 deaths. At the center of it all was a teenage couple, 19-year-old Charles Starkweather and his 14-year-old girlfriend, Carol Ann Fugate. Their names became associated with a story of teenage rebellion and severe tragedy. But while Starkweather was sentenced to death for his role, the question of Carol's guilt has never been fully resolved. Was she a willing accomplice or a terrified captive caught in a dangerous situation? Carol grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska. At just 13, she began dating Charles Starkweather, a young man already on the margins of society. Charles was known to idolize the actor James Dean and dressed in the rebellious style of the 1950s with slicked back hair and a defiant demeanor. But beneath this image was a troubled young man with a volatile temper and a reported fascination with dark themes. Carol, still a child in many ways, became infatuated with him. By January 1958, their relationship had taken a tragic turn. Following an argument with Carol's mother and stepfather, Starkweather's anger escalated. On January 21st, he was responsible for the deaths of Carol's mother, Velda, her stepfather, Marion Bartlett, and her 2-year-old half-sister, Betty Jean. Their remains stayed in the home, undiscovered for several days, while the couple remained there as if nothing had happened. Carol later claimed Starkweather told her that her family was being held hostage and that if she did not obey him, they would be harmed. What followed was a week-long crime spree that caused widespread fear across the Midwest. Starkweather and Carol stole cars, fled across Nebraska, and were connected to the deaths of several other individuals they encountered. Their victims included local teenagers, a wealthy farmer and his wife, and a traveling salesman. By the time they were captured in Wyoming, 11 people had lost their lives. The manhunt for Starkweather and Carol dominated national headlines. Newspapers compared the young couple to Bonnie and Clyde. The idea of teenagers, especially a 14-year-old girl, being at the center of such events shocked the nation. America was already experiencing anxiety about juvenile delinquency in the 1950s, and this case seemed to confirm the public's worst fears. When the pair was finally caught, Starkweather immediately attempted to shift much of the responsibility onto Carol. He claimed she had been just as involved as he was. Carol told a different story. She insisted she was his prisoner, forced to accompany him under threat of harm, and that she had no choice but to obey. The courts did not accept her account. In 1958, Carol Ann Fugit became the youngest female in U.S. history to be tried and convicted of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison at just 15 years old. Starkweather, meanwhile, was sentenced to death, and the punishment was carried out in 1959. Carol served 17 years behind bars before being paroled in 1976. After her release, she moved to Michigan, married, and lived quietly, avoiding the public spotlight as much as possible. Yet, the debate over her level of guilt has never gone away. Many argue that Carol was simply too young to have been a willing participant. They point to her age, barely a teenager, and the psychological hold Starkweather likely had over her. They note her consistent claim that she believed her family was still alive during the first days of the spree. To them, Carol was as much a victim as the people Starkweather targeted. Others see it differently. They argue that Carol had opportunities to escape, that she remained with Starkweather for too long to be entirely innocent, and that her story of being a hostage was a convenient explanation. The seriousness of the crimes, they say, could not have gone unnoticed by someone traveling with him day after day. In her later years, Carol spoke publicly to maintain her innocence. She asserted that she was manipulated, terrified, and powerless as a 14-year-old girl caught in the orbit of an older, controlling partner. She sought a formal pardon, though it was never granted. In 2020, she appeared in a documentary, once again telling her side of the story and insisting she was not the person history had painted her to be. Regardless of which version of events one believes, the facts remain deeply troubling. 11 lives were lost in a series of tragic acts that gripped the nation. Today, Carol lives quietly, far removed from the girl she once was. Yet her name remains linked to one of the most complex chapters in American juvenile crime history. Her case forces us to confront the uneasy reality that innocence and guilt are not always easy to separate, especially when youth and serious crime intersect. How should the justice system evaluate the culpability of a minor involved in a series of serious crimes with an older partner? And where does the line between coercion and willing participation lie when the defendant is only 14 years old?
Please love your children. Please love every second you have with your children. Never think that they know you love them. Always tell them you love them. Always watch over them, make sure they're safe, know where they're at, who they're with, and never take them for granted.
In January of 1992, a tragic case of teenage violence unfolded in Madison, Indiana, leaving a lasting mark on American history. The victim was Shanda Scherer, a 12-year-old middle school student remembered as lively, outgoing, and full of promise. She loved cheerleading, music, and spending time with friends. Those who knew her described her as energetic, funny, and always ready to brighten a room. Yet, beneath the surface of her teenage world, a conflict was brewing, one that would ultimately lead to her death. At the center of the turmoil was 16-year-old Melinda Loveless. She had been in a relationship with another girl, Amanda Hevrin, but when Amanda grew close to Shanda, Melinda's jealousy deepened into resentment. To her, Shanda became a rival, and she convinced herself that something drastic had to be done. On the night of January 10, 1992, Melinda enlisted the help of 3 friends, Lori Tackett, 17, Hope Rippey, 15, and Tony Lawrence, 15. Together, they devised a plan to lure Shanda away from her home under the pretense of meeting Amanda. Trusting them, Shanda quietly left her house that night, unaware of what awaited her. The teenagers drove Shanda to a remote location where Melinda revealed her true intentions. Over the following hours, Shanda endured severe mistreatment and threats. Forensic reports would later document evidence of prolonged suffering, including physical assault and restraint, before her life was taken. In an effort to conceal their actions, the group set her remains on fire. By morning, the 4 girls returned to their routines as though nothing had happened, eating breakfast, socializing, and even laughing together. But the truth unraveled quickly. Within days, Tony Lawrence, overwhelmed by guilt, confessed to her parents. Soon after, all 4 were arrested. News of the case stunned the nation, not only because of the cruelty inflicted, but because the perpetrators were so young. The image of teenage girls, typically associated with schoolwork, dances, and friendships, clashed sharply with the reality of what had occurred. During trial proceedings, disturbing details about each girl's background emerged. Melinda Loveless, considered the ringleader, had grown up in an abusive household marked by trauma and instability. Lori Tackett, the oldest, came from a religious but deeply troubled home and had expressed fascination with the occult and dark themes. Hope Rippey and Tony Lawrence were viewed largely as followers who became caught up in Melinda's obsession and influence. Prosecutors faced a moral and legal dilemma. These were minors, but the severity of the crime seemed far beyond what juvenile courts could address. Ultimately, all 4 were tried as adults. Lori Tackett received a 60-year sentence. Melinda Loveless received 46 years. Hope Rippey was sentenced to 60 years, with 10 years suspended. Tony Lawrence, who had confessed early and cooperated with investigators, was given a 20-year sentence. For Shanda's family, no punishment could ever restore what had been taken. Her mother, Jackie, transformed her grief into advocacy, keeping her daughter's memory alive through speaking out about the dangers of teen violence and the importance of awareness. In time, Jackie made an extraordinary choice. She forgave Melinda Loveless. She even corresponded with her in prison and later supported rehabilitation programs connected to her. For many, this act of compassion was nearly unimaginable, yet it reflected Jackie's desire to prevent more lives from being consumed by hate and revenge. In the years that followed, all 4 of the young women were eventually released from prison, though at different times. Their reintegration into society was met with controversy, with many feeling justice had not been served fully. To this day, the case raises difficult questions about accountability, rehabilitation, and the psychology of group violence. What makes this case particularly haunting is the group dynamic. 4 teenagers encouraging and escalating one another's actions until the unthinkable became reality. It invites us to ask, how can jealousy, peer pressure, and youthful anger combine into such destructive force? Could intervention at an earlier stage, whether at school, home, or within friendships, have prevented this tragedy? And what lessons can society learn from the fact that even the youngest among us are capable of such devastating choices? As we reflect on this case, we are left with questions that extend far beyond the courtroom. How do we teach young people to manage conflict, jealousy, and rejection in healthy ways? And how should justice systems balance punishment with the possibility of rehabilitation when juveniles commit adult-level crimes?
Who are you?
I'm back out here for a second. Do you recognize her? Yeah, she's my daughter. What's her name? Isabella.
Is he insane? Your name is Samantha.
You're gonna ruin my whole life because I have some random crazy like me.
In August of 2013, a serious incident in Aurora, Colorado, brought national attention to the story of Isabella Guzman, an 18-year-old whose suburban life appeared unremarkable on the surface. But how often do outward appearances conceal complex realities? Behind the facade of a typical family home, a narrative of escalating tension and conflict was unfolding between Isabella, her mother, Yun Hoi, and her stepfather. Contemporaries offered conflicting descriptions of her, painting a picture of a young woman who was at times shy and at other times defiant. School officials noted she had difficulties with authority figures. At home, disagreements between Isabella and her mother reportedly became more frequent and intense, often revolving around issues of discipline, household expectations, and Isabella's desire for greater independence. The family dynamic grew so strained that on the night of August 28, 2013, Yun Hoi felt compelled to ask Isabella's biological father to intervene in an attempt to de-escalate the situation. He later recounted leaving the home with a sense of unease, aware of the friction but never anticipating the tragic events that would follow. Later that evening, while Yun Hoi was in the bathroom, Isabella entered the room with a knife from the kitchen. A confrontation followed, and by the time her stepfather gained access to the room, Yun Hoi had suffered injuries that proved fatal. The evidence found at the scene was significant, and even seasoned law enforcement officers who responded were reportedly affected by what they encountered. Isabella was apprehended by police shortly after, not far from the family's residence. As the case proceeded to court, a stark contrast emerged between the prosecution's narrative of a deliberate act and the defense's argument for an alternative explanation. Isabella's conduct following her arrest was noted as unusual. Her mugshot captured a distant, smiling expression, and during court appearances, she often seemed detached from the gravity of the proceedings. This raised a critical question. How does the justice system navigate a case where the lines between intent and pathology are blurred? Medical evaluations provided a potential answer, diagnosing Isabella with paranoid schizophrenia. Mental health experts testified that she was experiencing severe hallucinations and delusions, believing her mother was a hostile entity from whom she needed to protect herself. Based on this extensive testimony, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. Consequently, Isabella was not sentenced to prison, but was instead committed indefinitely to the Colorado Mental Health Institute in Pueblo, where she would remain until deemed no longer a threat to herself or others. The verdict prompted a complex public reaction, with some acknowledging the role of her severe mental illness, while others struggled to reconcile the lack of a traditional prison sentence with the nature of the act. However, the story took an unexpected turn years later. In 2020, video clips from her 2013 court hearings began circulating on social media platforms like TikTok and YouTube. Her blank stare and detached smile, once evidence in a legal case, were now decontextualized and transformed into viral memes. But what happens when a person's mental health crisis becomes a source of online entertainment? Isabella Guzman became an internet phenomenon, viewed by millions through the distorted lens of short, edited clips. The digital response ranged from public fascination to misplaced sympathy and outrage, illustrating how modern internet culture can flatten a complex human tragedy into a consumable trend. This online revival often overshadowed the profound loss experienced by Yun Hoi's family and friends. While strangers debated Isabella's appearance and created compilations, a family was left to navigate their grief in the shadow of a viral sensation. In the years since her committal, Isabella has reportedly responded to treatment and has petitioned for release, stating through her doctors that medication and therapy have stabilized her condition. The viral images may be what the public remembers, but they are only a fragment of a larger story, one involving a family's devastation, a life lost, and a community left to contemplate the complex interplay of mental health, family dynamics, and the justice system. In an era where a family's tragedy can become a viral meme, how should society balance the complexities of mental illness in the justice system with the ethical responsibilities of online platforms and their users?
We were messing her out, and she fell back and hit her head.
What's your throat cut?
Yeah. Oh. You can't believe.
Grandma?
Oh my God.
In October of 2009, a small town in central Missouri became the setting for one of the most significant juvenile homicide cases in modern American history. The incident was not simply an act of impulsive aggression, it was described as calculated, premeditated, and carried out by a teenager who seemed to live a double life. At the center of it all was 15-year-old Alyssa Bustamante, a girl whose journals would later reveal a concerning fascination with the subject of mortality. Alyssa lived in St. Martin's, Missouri, a quiet community where most people knew each other. She was being raised primarily by her grandparents after her mother's struggles with addiction made parenting a challenge. To the outside world, she presented as a typical teenager. She attended high school, spent time online, and socialized with friends. But beneath this surface, Alyssa's life was facing significant challenges. As a child, she had struggled with depression and had engaged in self-harm. She had once been hospitalized for a suicide attempt, and those close to her knew she was deeply troubled. Still, many believed she was actively working through her issues, managing school and a social life in her own way. What was not apparent to others was that Alyssa was reportedly already planning an act of serious harm. On October 21, 2009, Alyssa invited her 9-year-old neighbor, Elizabeth Olton, into the woods. Elizabeth lived only a few doors down and reportedly trusted Alyssa. For Elizabeth's family, it was supposed to be an ordinary afternoon. She had gone to play at a friend's house and was expected home for dinner, but when she did not return, her family knew immediately that something was wrong. Elizabeth was described as a child who followed rules and never wandered off. That night, a sense of urgency spread across the community. Neighbors searched fields and woods with flashlights, police organized ground teams, and helicopters scanned the area. For days, the community experienced a mix of hope and apprehension. Elizabeth's mother held on to the hope that her daughter would be found alive, but the reality of the situation was already concealed in the nearby woods. Investigators soon focused on Alyssa. Her demeanor during questioning was noted as unusually calm, even detached. Eventually, she provided information that led police to a shallow grave she had reportedly prepared in advance. Inside were the remains of Elizabeth. Alyssa admitted that she was responsible for the girl's death, and investigators determined that it was the result of actions she had deliberately carried out. What most disturbed investigators was what they discovered in Alyssa's diary. On the very day of the incident, she had written about the event in strikingly detached terms. After describing what she had done, she ended the entry with the single misspelled word, "amazin'." That single page from her notebook became one of the most prominent pieces of evidence in an American juvenile crime case. The town of St. Martin's was deeply affected. Neighbors who once interacted warmly with Alyssa's grandparents now struggled with the new reality. Elizabeth's family faced the immense grief of losing their child in such a calculated manner. Meanwhile, Alyssa's relatives grappled with comprehending how the girl they had raised could be responsible for such an act. Prosecutors moved quickly to charge Alyssa as an adult. The circumstances of the crime were considered too deliberate for the juvenile system. At trial, the defense argued that Alyssa was severely mentally ill, pointing to her history of depression, medication, and suicide attempts. They described her as a troubled adolescent who had been signaling a need for help. The prosecution countered with her diary entry, the shallow graves she had prepared in advance, and her own statements to police. This was not a spontaneous act, they argued. It was methodical and intentional. In 2012, Alyssa accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and armed criminal action. The sentence was life in prison with a possibility of parole, plus 30 years. It meant she would one day have a chance at release, but it also recognized the seriousness of what she had done. The case did not end there. In the following years, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life sentences for juveniles were unconstitutional, sparking a wave of appeals across the country. Alyssa's lawyers tried to use this ruling to reduce her sentence. They argued that her age and mental health should afford her another chance, but Missouri courts upheld her punishment, pointing to the deliberate and severe nature of her actions. The Alyssa Bustamante case continues to be a subject of true crime discussions because it raises questions that are difficult to confront. How does a 15-year-old arrive at such a state of mind? Could different interventions have changed her path, or was the outcome unavoidable? Was Alyssa a victim of her own mental state, or was she an individual who concealed her intentions behind her age? In prison, Alyssa is said to have adjusted to life behind bars. Reports suggest she has taken classes and kept to herself, but the shadow of her crime will always follow her. Every parole hearing in the future will likely draw media attention, ensuring that the name Alyssa Bustamante is never forgotten. How should the justice system balance accountability and the potential for rehabilitation? When a juvenile commits a premeditated act that ends a life, especially when a documented history of severe mental illness complicates the understanding of intent. In the summer of 2014, Japan was once again forced to confront a deeply unsettling event. The death of a teenager caused not by a seasoned criminal, but by a high school girl. What made the case even more noteworthy was the setting. The city of Sasebo in Nagasaki Prefecture had already been the location of a widely remembered case in 2004, when an 11-year-old, nicknamed Nevada Tan, was responsible for the loss of a classmate inside a school. Just 10 years later, Sasebo was back in the national headlines for another tragedy that felt disconcertingly familiar. This time, the act was committed by a teenager known to the public only as Girl A. Her real name has never been released, in accordance with Japanese laws that protect the identities of juvenile offenders. But the secrecy surrounding her identity has done little to lessen the public's memory of her actions. To this day, Girl A remains a significant figure in true crime discussions. An intelligent, quiet student who affected her community with a case that seemed to defy explanation. The victim was 15-year-old Iwa Matsuo, one of her classmates at Sasebo High School. Iwa was described as cheerful, kind, and full of potential. She had friends, a supportive family, and a reputation as a bright student. By all appearances, she had a normal teenage life ahead of her. But on July 26, 2014, that life was cut short in a way that deeply unsettled even experienced investigators. The story began when Girl A invited Iwa to her apartment. It was not an unusual occurrence. Classmates often visited each other after school, and Iwa had no reason to be suspicious. However, what seemed like a simple social visit was, in reality, a premeditated event. For weeks, Girl A had been exhibiting troubling behaviors. Reports later revealed that she had a history of dissecting small animals and had spoken to peers about her fascination with death. How does a system address such warning signs when they are displayed by a minor? Teachers and counselors had noted her erratic moods and unusual interests, and even her father had attempted to get her professional help, but none of those measures prevented what was about to happen. Inside the apartment, Girl A attacked Iwa, using items she had taken from the home, leading to injuries that proved fatal. The subsequent investigation indicated that additional actions had been carried out after her death, details of which were considered highly concerning by authorities. When police questioned her, Girl A reportedly admitted responsibility with a notable lack of emotion. She told investigators she had wanted to know what it felt like to take a life. That detached explanation, combined with her age, left the country deeply unsettled. The media descended on Sasebo, and within hours, headlines declared the case one of the most significant juvenile crimes in recent Japanese history. The parallels to the Nevada Tan case a decade earlier made the story even more striking. Once again, in the very same city, a young girl had led a classmate to her death. Once again, Japan was forced to ask how such behavior could emerge from someone so young. The legal system faced a challenge. At 15, girl A could not face the same penalties as an adult, but the seriousness of her actions made the path to rehabilitation seem incredibly complex. She was placed under psychiatric evaluation and eventually sent to a juvenile reformatory. Doctors diagnosed her with severe mental health disorders, noting her lack of empathy and fixation on harmful themes. Authorities have kept the details of her treatment private, and her current whereabouts remain unknown. For the family of Iwa Matsuo, this secrecy provided no comfort. They had lost their daughter in an act of profound severity. Their grief was compounded by the fact that multiple people had raised red flags about girl A long before the incident. Teachers had expressed concern, her father had sought medical help, and peers had discussed her behavior. Yet somehow, those warnings had not been enough to prevent disaster. What makes the Sasebo High School case unforgettable is not only the unsettling nature of what happened, but the profound sense of déjà vu it created. The same city had already been marked by the 2004 incident, and now, just a decade later, a similar tragedy had unfolded. For many, Sasebo became synonymous not with its culture or history, but with two of the most widely discussed juvenile perpetrated crimes in modern Japan. When a community experiences a similar, profound tragedy twice in a decade, what does it reveal about the systemic challenges in identifying and effectively intervening with high-risk youth, even when warning signs are present? In 1968, the city of Newcastle upon Tyne in northern England became the focus of a case that would challenge the public's understanding of juvenile crime. The responsible party was not a known criminal or a member of a gang, it was a schoolgirl, just 10 years old at the time, named Mary Bell. Mary's early life was marked by significant hardship from the very beginning. She was born into poverty and raised in a home filled with instability and neglect. Her mother was absent for long periods, and her primary male role model was frequently involved with law enforcement. Teachers would later recall that Mary often exhibited challenging behavior in class, showing both defiance and an unusual lack of empathy for a child so young. Some classmates said she had a temper, while others remembered her as simply different. This raises a fundamental question. At what point does troubled behavior in a child signal a deeper, more serious issue? On May 25, 1968, the day before her 11th birthday, Mary led a 4-year-old boy named Martin Brown into an abandoned house. Hours later, his body was discovered by local children who were exploring the building. At first, police were perplexed. There were no obvious signs of a struggle and no clear explanation for the boy's death. Investigators initially considered it a tragic accident, but Mary's involvement did not end there. In the days following Martin's death, she returned to the neighborhood and began acting in ways that drew the concern of the community. She would reportedly ask other children if they wanted to see a dead boy, and spoke about Martin's death with a notable lack of emotional response. A few weeks later, a second incident occurred. On July 31, 1968, Mary, along with her 13-year-old friend Norma Bell, no relation, led another young boy, 3-year-old Brian Howe, to a nearby wasteland. The circumstances of his death showed clearer signs that it was intentional. The child was found lifeless, and forensic evidence confirmed he had been deliberately targeted. Investigators quickly realized this was no accident. The event sparked significant fear in the community. Parents kept their children indoors, concerned that a dangerous individual was in the area. When police began interviewing neighborhood children, Mary's name repeatedly surfaced. Her unusual behavior after both deaths had raised suspicions. Teachers recalled her creating unsettling drawings, and neighbors mentioned her unusual interest in the investigation. Eventually, Mary confessed to her involvement, but her attitude was considered highly unusual by authorities. She spoke about the acts with little sign of remorse, as if she did not fully comprehend the gravity of her actions. At just 11 years old, she was charged with 2 counts of manslaughter. The trial that followed drew enormous media attention, as the idea of a child committing such serious offenses was nearly unthinkable at the time. Psychiatrists who examined Mary described her as intelligent but manipulative, with traits consistent with psychopathy. They concluded that she understood the difference between right and wrong, but lacked the empathy most children naturally develop. In December 1968, Mary was found guilty of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. She was sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, meaning for an indefinite period until authorities deemed her no longer a threat. Mary spent the next 12 years in various institutions. She was released in 1980 at the age of 23, given a new identity, and granted anonymity to protect her from public backlash. Years later, this legal protection was controversially extended to cover her daughter, allowing the family to live in secret. But the public never forgot. Mary Bell became a well-known name in Britain, symbolizing both the shocking potential for harm in children and the complex debate about rehabilitation. This led to an enduring public discussion. Should an individual responsible for the deaths of 2 children ever be given the chance to live a normal life? Was she a product of her chaotic upbringing, or was she predisposed to this behavior from the start? For some, Mary represents the ultimate cautionary tale of what can happen when a child grows up surrounded by neglect and instability. For others, her story is evidence that harmful behavior can emerge at any age, regardless of background. People still question whether she truly changed after her release, or if the underlying issues that led to her actions ever fully resolved. We may never know the full truth because Mary Bell continues to live under legal protection, hidden in plain sight somewhere in the United Kingdom. When a child commits an act this serious, how can a society reconcile the need to protect the public and acknowledge the victim's loss with the ethical obligation to rehabilitate a young offender who was themselves a product of severe neglect? In the spring of 2004, the nation of Japan was confronted with an incident so unsettling that its digital footprint remains prominent even today. The events unfolded in Sasebo, a quiet city in Nagasaki Prefecture, and centered on an 11-year-old girl. While her given name was Natsumi Tsuji, she would become known to the world by a very different and more widely recognized online moniker. On June 1, 2004, an ordinary school day at Okubo Elementary took a dark turn. During the lunch break, 2 6th-grade girls, known to be close friends who often shared notes and after-school activities, disappeared from view. Reports would later indicate that the friendship had soured over online disagreements, with hurtful comments escalating over several weeks on internet message boards. That digital animosity was carried from the virtual world into the physical space of their school. Natsumi had invited her friend, Satomi Mitarai, into an unoccupied classroom. Once inside the empty room, Natsumi used an item she had brought with her and attacked Satomi, causing injuries that tragically proved fatal. When the two were eventually discovered by others at the school, it was a deeply distressing scene. Teachers immediately contacted emergency services, but Satomi did not survive. News of the death spread with alarming speed, first through the school, then the community, and finally, the entire country. The age of the responsible party, just 11 years old, was a source of profound shock, particularly in a country where serious crimes committed by children are exceedingly rare. As the story dominated national headlines, the police took Natsumi into custody. It was during this moment that a single photograph, captured by the media surrounding the school, would change the trajectory of the case in the public eye. The image showed the young girl being escorted by authorities wearing a sweatshirt with the word Nevada printed boldly across the front. This photograph quickly found its way to the internet, especially on Japanese forums like 2chan, where it became a cultural phenomenon. Users nicknamed her Nevada Tan, a label combining the sweatshirt's text with a diminutive Japanese honorific typically used for children. The name, despite its origins, carried a controversial dissonance with the gravity of the event, leading to an explosion of memes, fan art, and musical tributes. This transformed a local tragedy into one of the earliest and most prominent examples of a true crime case being reinterpreted as internet folklore, immortalizing the juvenile in a way no court proceeding could. The Japanese justice system was now faced with a profound challenge. At 11 years old, Natsumi was below the age of criminal responsibility in many parts of the world. However, Japan had previously lowered its minimum age for criminal accountability following another high-profile juvenile case in the 1990s. This meant that Natsumi could be held legally responsible for her actions. Instead of being sent to a traditional prison, she was remanded to a youth reformatory, with the stated goal being rehabilitation over punitive measures. Authorities took steps to protect her identity, and after the initial media storm, her face was not publicly shown again. The incident ignited a nationwide debate, forcing society to grapple with difficult questions surrounding juvenile justice, the influence of internet culture, access to harmful media, and the dynamics of childhood bullying. In response, schools implemented stricter safety protocols, and lawmakers faced pressure to reevaluate the legal framework for handling juvenile offenders. Even years later, the Nevada Tan meme has persisted in online subcultures. The iconic image of the sweatshirt continues to be shared, sparking discussions that often detach from the tragic reality of the event. But for Satomi's family, the loss of their 12-year-old daughter was a profound and irreversible tragedy, not a subject for internet irony. In the years that followed, Natsumi's path has been kept from public view. Japanese law protects the identities of juvenile offenders into adulthood, so official reports on her life after her release from the reformatory are non-existent. Speculation suggests she was quietly reintegrated into society under a new identity, but the truth of her adult life remains unknown. The case of Natsumi Tsuji serves as a sobering reminder that serious acts of violence are not exclusively the domain of adults. They can emerge from the most unexpected of circumstances, an elementary school classroom between two young friends, carried out by an individual many believed was too young to contemplate such an act. While the world may never know the woman Natsumi Tsuji became, the internet has ensured that everyone remembers Nevada Tan, the online avatar of a child who shocked a nation and became one of the most widely discussed symbols of youth crime in the modern era. When a real-world tragedy is transformed into an internet icon, where does our collective responsibility lie in balancing the memory of the victim, the potential for a juvenile offender's rehabilitation, and the prevention of future tragedies? From the case of the schoolgirl in Japan who was involved in the tragic loss of a classmate, to the teenagers in America whose actions led to the loss of their own best friend, these stories present complex and troubling questions about juvenile crime. They are examples of individuals who betrayed trust, of friendships that ended in tragedy, and they serve as a stark reminder that age is not a barrier to committing serious acts. Each case forces a difficult examination of the factors at play, from mental health and social pressures to personal accountability. If you found this analysis of these complex cases informative, please consider subscribing and enabling notifications for more content. Finally, we'd like you to consider a broader question in the comments. What do you believe is the most critical factor for society to address in preventing such tragedies? Is it improving mental health support, fostering healthier social environments for young people, or reforming the juvenile justice system?